Welcome back, everyone, to Sip&Talk. This is EP410, and we're really diving into the deep end today, a very hypothetical topic.
Definitely. It's one of those big what-if questions that you see floating around online sometimes.
Exactly. Inspired by those late-night forum discussions, But we're going to try and approach it, well, methodically.
Right. Think of it as a massive thought experiment. Today's mission, if you will, is not about predicting the future. Definitely not.
No crystal balls here.
None at all. It's more like radical risk assessment. We want to objectively explore the idea of China without the Communist Party. Does the country just disappear?
Yeah, does it die, as some narrative suggests?
Yeah.
What could actually happen? And maybe most intriguingly, why might its neighbors feel a sense of relief?
Our goal, really, is for you, our listener. We want you to get the logic behind these, frankly, extreme arguments.
So when you see headlines maybe down the road about potential Chinese instability, you won't just be overwhelmed by fear or, information overload.
You'll have a framework. You'll understand the different angles.
Yeah. Okay, so where do we start? I guess we need to look at where these ideas even come from. Western contingency planning.
Exactly. That's a really important place where this kind of thinking happens. So when people talk about a post-CCP China, it's not just random speculation online, though it's definitely there too.
Right. You see it in overseas dissident communities, lots of different visions for what could come next. Online forums are full of it.
But there's a second, much more, let's say, structured universe where this happens, and that's inside Western think tanks, academic circles, policy planning groups.
People whose job it is to think about national security strategy.
Precisely. For them, it's not really about hoping for it or wanting it. It's pure scenario planning, preparing for things that probably won't happen. But if they did, the impact would be huge.
Low probability, high impact events. That's the jargon.
That's the one. And we actually have a really concrete example of this. The Hudson Institute. Apparently, they held a conference back in, I think the plan was for 2025, titled, and this is pretty blunt, After the Fall, Planning for a Post-Communist China.
Wow. After the fall. It doesn't leave much to the imagination.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just like a casual chat over coffee. This was serious players in the security and policy world getting together.
To talk about what the U.S. and others should do, like the moment CCP control collapses.
Exactly that. What do you do instantly? How do you react to try and maintain stability? How do you even think about reconstructing political systems, economic systems?
And they put out a report too, didn't they?
They did. China after communism. Preparing for a post-CCP China. And it apparently went into some serious detail, real nitty-gritty stuff.
Okay, like what kind of details are we talking about?
Well, things like setting up transitional constitutional frameworks, implementing transition justice, which is a whole complicated field about dealing with past abuses, corruption.
Right, holding people accountable maybe,
Okay.
or reconciliation.
Both, potentially. And critically, how you'd restructure the People's Liberation Army, the PLA.
That sounds incredibly difficult. It's a party army, fundamentally. How do you turn it into a national army loyal to a new state or constitution?
It's a massive challenge, probably one of the biggest operational hurdles you could imagine. Think about it, the PLA's whole identity, its command structure, its doctrine, it's all tied to the party.
Untangling that, ensuring loyalty shifts, making sure, the critical assets stay secure, especially the nukes.
That's the nightmare scenario right there. Keeping control of the nuclear arsenal under a new, probably fragile authority. The simulations apparently see this as like the most immediate and dangerous variable, chaos variable number one.
And the report didn't just stick to central government stuff, did it? It mentioned specific regions.
No, it apparently got into the really sensitive areas. How would the international community or a new Chinese government handle regions like Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia, even Ningxia and Guangxi?
So thinking about potential autonomy or even independence movements flaring up.
It seems so. It confirms that Western planners are at least considering the possibility that the map of China itself could change in such a scenario.
Which brings up the big question, why? Why spend all this time and brain power planning for something that, let's be honest, most analysts think is pretty unlikely, at least anytime soon?
Yeah, that's fair. I think we can see maybe three main reasons, three drivers behind this kind of contingency planning.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First one's the most straightforward. Risk preparation. Just basic contingency planning. If there's even a tiny, say, 1% chance of a system as huge and globally interconnected as China experiencing a catastrophic failure.
You have to have a plan. You can't just react passively when it happens.
Exactly. You need to know roughly what levers you might pull if, say, the central bank suddenly isn't functioning or if millions of refugees start crossing borders. It's about reducing that passive risk, minimizing the damage.
Okay, that makes sense. What's number 2?
Number 2 is a bit more, well, strategic. Let's call it competition and psychological warfare.
Ah, okay. How does that work?
Well, think about it. By holding these high-profile simulations, publishing reports with titles like After the Fall, the policy world is sending a message.
A message that the current system isn't permanent, that it's fragile.
Precisely. It subtly shapes the narrative in the ongoing competition between the U.S. and China. It acts as an ideological tool, framing the CCP system as potentially reversible, planting seeds of doubt, maybe internally in China, maybe among its partners.
Interesting. And the third reason, you mentioned geopolitics.
Yeah, this is pure geopolitical calculation.
Right.
Realpolitik, if you like. Imagine China does fall into chaos. Fragmentation, conflict, whichever outside power or coalition of powers can step in credibly to help with stabilization or reconstruction. They gain enormous influence.
Right. You get to help shape the new institutions, maybe embed your own values, secure strategic alliances, basically fill the power vacuum.
Exactly. It's about being ready to potentially export your model, your influence, into what could be a newly opening strategic space.
So these plans aren't neutral. They often come with assumptions about democracy, rule of law.
Absolutely. And that's where the criticism comes in, right? People immediately worry about U.S. intervention or even darker whispers of recolonization, like planning to carve things up before anything's even happened.
It's a really fine line to walk.
It is. And we have to stress again, these are simulations, they're thought exercises, they are not official U.S. government policy blueprints stamped and ready to go.
But they exist because the consequences of not thinking about it, of being totally unprepared for an event of this magnitude, well, that's seen as potentially even more dangerous for global stability.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and tackle the narrative that the CCP itself promotes. That famous line, no communist party, no new China.
Right. This is absolutely central to their legitimacy, to how they govern. It's what some scholars call fear governance.
Fear governance, meaning?
Meaning they deliberately weaponize history. They tap into this really deep collective cultural fear in China of Luan Xi periods of chaos, civil war, warlords running rampant. It's a recurring nightmare in Chinese history.
And the party positions itself as the only thing preventing that, the indispensable stability anchor.
Exactly. The implicit message is, challenge us, get rid of us, and you plunge the entire nation back into that primordial conflict and suffering.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful message.
Does history actually back that up? I mean, Chinese history is incredibly long.
That's a crucial point. History actually refutes it profoundly. If you take the long view, Chinese civilization isn't defined by the CCP. It's defined by its incredible continuity despite constant political change.
You mean the dynasties rising and falling?
Exactly. Think about it. The Qin dynasty falls, the Han rises, the Sui collapses, the Tang emerges, the Yuan, the Ming, the Qing. Each time a ruling regime ended, sometimes violently, sometimes through decay.
The political structure changed.
Right, the government changed. But the civilization itself, the language, the culture, the core territory, the people it endured, it continued.
So the end of a dynasty wasn't the end of China. It was more like a political reset.
Precisely. Each transition, however painful it might have been at the time, ultimately led to a kind of social self-repair and governance renewal. The state, the fundamental entity, didn't vanish. It just got new management.
Okay, so maybe help us make that distinction clearer for everyone listening, the difference between the regime and the state.
Good point. The state is the durable thing. It's the territory, the population, the core institutions think, the bureaucracy, the infrastructure network, the financial system, things that persist over time. It's the hardware, maybe.
And the regime.
The regime is the specific group in power at any given moment. The current management team, if you like. So the CCP is the current regime in China. The Soviet Politburo was the regime in the USSR.
So the regime can collapse.
Absolutely. Regimes come and go throughout history. But the state, the underlying entity, usually persists. It adapts, gets a new regime, a new operating system.
And we've seen this happen elsewhere, right? Modern examples.
Definitely. Look at Germany after 1945. The Nazi regime was utterly obliterated. But Germany, the nation, the state, didn't cease to exist. It was reborn, arguably much stronger, as a democratic economic powerhouse.
And Imperial Japan.
Same story. The militaristic regime responsible for World War II was dismantled. But Japan, the state, endured, adopted a new constitution, and became a global economic leader. The political system changed fundamentally, but the state survived, and you could argue thrived in a new form.
So applying that logic, the end of the CCP wouldn't necessarily mean the end of China as a country or civilization.
Not based on historical or comparative political precedent, no. It would mean the end of a specific political system, paving the way for a new one.
Okay. So if the CCP isn't indispensable for China's existence, let's look at how it does maintain power now. You mentioned legitimacy pillars.
Right, the CCP's survival recipe, so to speak, analysts usually point to three main pillars holding it up, but they all have weaknesses.
Let's hear them. Pillar 1.
Performance legitimacy. This is the big one, historically. It's the implicit deal. We, the party, rule unchallenged, and in return, we deliver economic growth, better infrastructure, rising living standards, stability and prosperity.
But that pillar seems a bit shaky right now, doesn't it?
Extremely shaky. The ongoing housing crisis, Evergrande just being the tip of the iceberg, the massive local government debt problems, the slowdown in growth, historically high youth unemployment, all of these things directly attack that narrative of competence in delivering the goods.
So when the economy falters, that promise breaks down and the legitimacy based on it starts to crumble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which forces them to rely more heavily on the other pillars. Pillar 2 is nationalism legitimacy.
Rallying around the flag.
Pretty much. The party constantly uses external friction tensions with the U.S. over trade or tech, historical grievances with Japan, the situation with Taiwan to build internal unity.
The argument being, only we, the CCP, can stand up to these hostile foreign forces trying to keep China down.
That's the narrative. It's effective, to a degree. External pressure can create a rally effect, but it's a sort of nervous reactive energy. It relies on constantly identifying enemies.
Okay, and the third pillar?
Ideological legitimacy. This is the deeper claim, that the CCP isn't just a political party, but the unique historical inheritor of the mission to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
That they're destined to lead China back to global prominence.
Exactly. It's woven into the entire education system, the propaganda, the historical narrative they promote. It tries to fuse the identity of the party with the identity of the nation itself, making them seem inseparable in people's minds.
Which brings us to this idea of the silent majority. What's that about?
It's the argument that in a state with such pervasive surveillance and censorship, you can't actually know what most people truly think or prefer.
Because expressing dissent is too risky.
Right. So the observed silence, the apparent lack of opposition, isn't necessarily genuine support or obedience. For many, it might just be strategic adaptation. People rationally calculate that the personal cost of speaking out is simply too high, so they stay quiet to survive, to protect their families, their careers.
It sounds like a pressure cooker situation. Stable on the surface, maybe, but with immense pressure building underneath.
That's a good analogy. That repressed desire for change, or just for less control, is potentially a huge force. Yeah. But it probably needs some kind of major shock to actually break through the surface.
Like what? What kind of catalyst?
It could be anything that shatters the party's image of control and competence. A severe economic collapse, maybe. A major political crisis or scandal at the very top. Perhaps a disastrous military adventure that goes wrong.
Something big enough to overwhelm the state's ability to enforce that silence through the security forces and the surveillance tech.
Exactly. Something that makes the risk of inaction seem greater than the risk of action for a critical mass of people.
Okay, let's return to that dark scenario from the Hudson Institute simulation. The immediate aftermath. The power vacuum.
Right. The moment central CCP authority just vanishes. Maybe the leaders flee, maybe internal communications break down, maybe the Great Firewall collapses. What happens in those first few weeks or months?
Based on historical parallels, like the Soviet collapse or the Arab Spring, it doesn't sound pretty.
No. The models generally predict severe chaos erupting almost immediately, likely on three main fronts.
Okay, front number 1.
Political fragmentation and potential warlordism. The vertical chain of command from Beijing down to the provinces and cities breaks.
So local leaders are suddenly on their own.
Pretty much. And what do? Provincial party bosses, mayors.
Yeah.
They'd likely move very fast to secure their own power bases. They might rebrand themselves as regional governors or protectors.
And they'd need muscle to do that, controlling local police, military units.
Exactly. Seizing control of local security forces would be priority number 1, to protect their territory, their resources, themselves.
And this is where the military risk comes in again, right? What if the central PLA command structure fractures?
That's the nightmare. If different regional military districts, especially powerful ones like the Western Theater Command covering Xinjiang and Tibet, or the Southern Theater Command overlooking the South China Sea, refuse to obey whatever weak central authority tries to emerge.
You could get commanders becoming de facto warlords, using their troops to carve out fiefdoms.
It's a definite risk, leading to military warlordization and localized conflicts over borders, strategic assets, maybe ethnic tensions flaring up between regions.
And speaking of tensions, what about the independence movements?
Simultaneously, you'd almost certainly see an immediate explosion of secessionist activity in places with strong historical movements. Tibet, Xinjiang, possibly Inner Mongolia. Groups there might declare independence or try to break away immediately.
Potentially with support from outside groups or internal resistance movements.
Very likely. Which could lead to immediate civil conflict within those regions, or attempts by adjacent warlords to seize control. So, political chaos, military fragmentation. What's the second front?
Economic paralysis and the rise of oligarchs.
Right. Remember what happened in Russia after the Soviet Union fell?
Oh yeah, the oligarchs. Former party officials, KGB guys, savvy businessmen, they scooped up state assets for pennies on the dollar.
Exactly. Predatory privatization on a massive scale. Now imagine that in China, where the state controls even more of the economy. The banks, the energy companies, the land, the huge state-owned enterprises, SOEs.
So the red aristocracy, the families of top officials, the politically connected billionaires, they'd be perfectly positioned.
Perfectly. They'd use the chaos, the lack of oversight, to engineer a massive wealth transfer, seizing control of SOEs, banks, infrastructure, resources, converting their political connections into permanent, inherited economic dominance.
Creating a new class of super oligarchs who would likely resist any attempt at real democratic reform or accountability later on.
Precisely. Similar to the Russian experience. And tied to this, you have the local debt bomb.
Ah, right. We talked about that threatening legitimacy. How does it play out in a collapse?
Catastrophically. These local governments owe trillions, much of it off the books. They rely on land sales and transfers from the central government to stay afloat.
If Beijing collapses, those transfers stop. Land sales probably freeze.
Exactly. So countless local and provincial governments would face immediate bankruptcy. They wouldn't be able to pay salaries, maintain infrastructure, provide basic public services, grinding local economies to a halt.
Okay, so political fragmentation, economic oligarchy. What's the third front of chaos?
A social disorder. The collapse of the security state, the police, the surveillance. It would unleash decades of pent-up anger and frustration.
Anger over what? Corruption, inequality, land grabs.
All of the above. The staggering gap between the super-rich, connected elite and ordinary people. Deep resentment against corrupt local officials. You could see widespread social unrest, riots, maybe even looting and violent score settling. People know who got rich unfairly in their own communities.
A very dangerous, volatile situation.
Extremely. Plus, you'd have an ideological vacuum. The official communist ideology vanishes overnight. What rushes in to fill that void?
All sorts of competing ideas, I guess. Liberalism, nationalism, regional identities, religion.
All competing fiercely. A chaotic marketplace of ideas, potentially leading to more social confusion and conflict.
And amidst all this chaos, there's that specific worry, the really critical stuff.
Yeah, the issue of critical assets. This is what keeps global security planners awake at night.
Beyond the nukes, what else?
Well, maintaining control over the core financial systems, preventing a total meltdown. Securing major energy infrastructure like oil and gas pipelines, especially in the West. Managing massive projects like the Three Gorges Dam to prevent catastrophic failures.
It's about preventing the internal chaos from triggering even bigger, potentially transnational disasters.
Exactly. The complexity is just mind-boggling.
Okay, so let's imagine somehow the country gets through that initial terrifying phase of chaos. Maybe the first year, maybe longer. What happens next? What are the potential long-term paths for this huge territory and population?
Analysts usually sketch out two main trajectories after the initial shock settles, maybe over a 2 to 10 year time frame, Path A and Path B.
Let's start with the gloomy one, Path B.
Path B is the pessimistic route. Fragmentation and decay. Basically, the initial chaos never really resolves. Regional mistrust, warlordism, maybe ethnic conflicts become entrenched.
So, like the former Yugoslavia, but on a vastly larger scale. Or the more chaotic parts of the post-Soviet space.
That's the kind of model, yes. The deep cultural and economic ties aren't strong enough to overcome the political fragmentation. You end up with long-term internal conflict, economic stagnation, maybe waves of humanitarian crises.
And in this scenario, does China stay one country on the map?
Maybe nominally, maybe not. You could see the emergence of multiple de facto independent states. Perhaps wealthy coastal areas like Guangdong or the Shanghai region become highly autonomous economic city-states, focused only on trade and ignoring the rest of the country.
While the interior provinces descend into deeper poverty and instability.
That's the grim picture in Path B. A failed state scenario, essentially.
Okay, not great. What's the alternative? Path A.
Path A is the more optimistic route, reconfiguration and potentially federalism. This is generally seen as maybe more likely in the long run.
Why more likely?
Because despite the political chaos, the underlying cultural cohesion, the integrated economy, the shared language and history, these are powerful forces pulling towards some form of unity. Plus, the sheer logistical nightmare of actually breaking up China permanently is immense.
So Path A assumes some kind of new unity eventually emerges from the rubble.
It would likely involve a period of negotiation among the surviving regional powers. The new governors, military leaders, influential intellectuals, maybe business figures, they'd have to convene some kind of national reconciliation conference.
To hammer out a new deal. A new way for the regions to live together.
Exactly. And the goal probably wouldn't be to recreate the old, highly centralized system. That model would have just failed spectacularly. The most plausible outcome, many analysts think, is some form of Chinese Federal Republic or Chinese Confederation.
Federalism? Really? But isn't Chinese political culture historically very centralist? Han Chinese dominance, Beijing controlling everything? Why would federalism suddenly work?
That's a really valid challenge. And it's why the transition is so perilous. Federalism wouldn't emerge out of historical preference, but out of sheer necessity.
Meaning
the chaos of the collapse itself would demonstrate the failure of hyper-centralization. And regional identities, think Cantonese, Sichuanese, Shanghainese, Northeasterners, while suppressed politically, are very real culturally and economically.
So federalism becomes the compromise, the way to keep the country together while giving these powerful regions what they want.
Pretty much. Granting provinces and maybe ethnic regions significant autonomy over things like taxes, education, local policing, perhaps cultural affairs, while a new, limited central government handles core functions.
Like what? Foreign policy, a national military, if reformed, maybe managing the currency, upholding a basic rule of law framework.
Exactly. Something maybe analogous to the EU or the US federal system, balancing regional power with essential central coordination. It's a compromise born from crisis to prevent total disintegration.
And the key would be making sure that new central government isn't just another dictatorship, right? It needs checks and balances.
Absolutely critical. Establishing genuine rule of law, separation of powers, maybe a multi-party system, even if regionally based initially. That would be essential for the long-term legitimacy and stability of this new federal structure.
Okay, this leads to a really interesting question then. If Path A, this federal reconfiguration, actually happens successfully, could a post-CCP China actually end up being stronger?
It's counterintuitive given the chaos we discussed, but potentially, yes.
How so?
Well, think about the drags on the current system. The immense waste from corruption, the inefficiency baked into the state-controlled economy, the suppression of innovation and free thought, the resources poured into social control and censorship.
If you remove those.
If you replace them with genuine institutional efficiency, real rule of law protecting property rights and contracts, unleash the private sector, allow freer information flow, combine that with China's massive population, its existing industrial base, its human capital.
You could see a huge resurgence of dynamism.
Potentially. A new Chinese state, more integrated into the global system based on rules rather than coercion, focused on internal development rather than external expansion, could, in the long run, be a more robust and genuinely influential power.
But that's a big if. Depends entirely on the transition succeeding.
Completely. If Path A fails, if the warlords and oligarchs manage to hang on to power even within a nominally unified but dysfunctional state, then the result is long-term stagnation, internal friction, and relative weakness on the world stage. The quality of the political transition is everything.
Okay, let's shift perspective now. Let's look outwards. If this huge disruptive transition happens inside China, why would its neighbors, Japan, India, Vietnam, Korea, the ASEAN countries, why would they collectively, as you put it, breathe a sigh of relief?
It boils down to one core thing. the security relief effect.
Meaning the main source of regional anxiety and threat is suddenly gone, or at least neutralized.
Exactly. For decades, the CCP's China has been the dominant, often expansionist, and ideologically challenging power in Asia. Its paralysis or fragmentation removes that primary pressure point.
Okay, break that down. What specific pressures ease up?
First, and most obviously, military threat reduction. The constant pressure in the South China Sea, the incursions around Taiwan, the border tensions with India, all driven by a centrally directed, increasingly assertive PLA.
If the PLA fractures, or is focused inward on survival,
that pressure evaporates almost overnight. Japan sees fewer intrusions near the Senkakus. Vietnam and the Philippines get breathing room in the South China Sea disputes. India feels less immediate pressure on the Himalayan border. It's a massive military decompression for the entire region.
Okay, military relief. What else?
Second, the end of wolf warrior diplomacy. You know, that hyper-aggressive, insulting, bullying diplomatic style that China adopted.
Yeah, that didn't win them many friends.
Not really. It damaged relations across the board. A transitional government or fragmented regional authorities simply wouldn't have the capacity or the inclination to maintain that kind of a global diplomatic offensive. They'd be focused on internal survival and seeking aid, not picking fights.
Makes sense. And a third point.
The end of systematic economic weaponization. The CCP frequently used its massive market and control over trade as a tool of political coercion.
Right, punishing countries like Australia over political disagreements by blocking coal or wine imports, or Lithuania for opening a Taiwanese representative office.
Exactly. That kind of centrally directed strategic use of trade sanctions requires a powerful unified state. Without it, trade might become chaotic, but it wouldn't be wielded as a coherent geopolitical weapon in the same way. Relations would likely normalize based on commercial logic, not political diktat.
So less military threat, less diplomatic bullying, less economic coercion. Sounds like a good deal for the neighbors.
From a purely geopolitical standpoint, it opens up huge opportunities for regional reshaping.
How so? For ASEAN, for example.
For ASEAN, it's potentially transformative. For years, they've been caught in this uncomfortable balancing act, forced to navigate between Washington and Beijing.
Trying not to choose sides.
Right. With the primary regional hegemon preoccupied or fragmented, ASEAN nations gain genuine strategic autonomy. They can pursue regional integration and economic cooperation on their own terms, without constantly looking over their shoulder at Beijing's reaction.
What about India?
For India, the relief would be immense. The border dispute has been a massive drain on resources and strategic attention. A reduction in that pressure allows India to refocus on its own economic development, maritime security in the Indian Ocean, and its broader global role.
And for the region's democracies, Japan, South Korea, maybe the Philippines.
It eases the ideological pressure. They've been on the front lines of dealing with a powerful authoritarian neighbor trying to promote its model and undermine democratic norms through economic leverage and influence operations. That pressure significantly reduces.
Okay, so it sounds like champagne corks popping all around China's border.
Oh, hold on. That's the long-term strategic relief. In the short term, the immediate crisis phase we talked about earlier, that presents huge dangers for the neighbors too.
Right, you can't have one without the other. This relief is tempered by immediate fear.
Absolutely. We have to acknowledge the flip side, the most immediate worry.
Refugee crisis.
Potentially massive. If there's widespread violence or economic collapse, you could see millions of people trying to flee across China's borders into Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia.
And those countries are mostly not equipped to handle that kind of influx.
Not even close. It would create enormous humanitarian crises and potentially destabilize the border regions of neighboring states.
Okay, refugees. What else?
Economic shock. China isn't just a regional power. It's the factory of the world and a huge consumer market. If its economy suddenly collapses,
global supply chains seize up overnight.
Everything from electronics to car parts to textiles, instant global recession, with Asia being hit the hardest and fastest. Companies reliant on Chinese manufacturing or consumers would face immediate crisis.
So massive disruption. And the third, immediate risk.
Circling back to where we started, nuclear security and conflict spillover. The absolute top priority for the international community would be making sure China's nuclear weapons remain secure and don't fall into rogue hands.
And preventing internal fighting, say over resources in Xinjiang or water rights along a major river, from spilling across borders and potentially dragging neighbors into the conflict.
Exactly. So while the long-term strategic picture might look better for neighbors, the immediate transition period is fraught with extreme danger and requires careful international crisis management. It's a real paradox.
Wow. Okay. That was a lot to take in. An incredibly complex and, sobering thought experiment. Let's try and quickly recap the main takeaways from this Sip and Talk.
Sure. First, we established that the whole no party, no China idea is fundamentally a political narrative. It's a tool for fear dependence, not necessarily a reflection of historical reality.
Right. Chinese civilization, the state, has shown incredible resilience through centuries of regime change it endures.
Second, while a post-CCP transition would almost certainly be incredibly messy and dangerous in the short-term risks of chaos, warlords, oligarchs grabbing assets, social upheaval,
the most likely long-term outcome, if total fragmentation is avoided, seems to be some kind of reorganization. Probably a federal or confederal system, born out of necessity to keep the vast country together by granting regions more autonomy.
And third, geopolitically, the neighbors would experience significant security relief from the removal of an expansionist power. But, and this is a huge but, that relief is heavily counterbalanced by the immediate, severe risks of refugee flows, economic collapse, and conflict spillover during the transition.
So the bottom line isn't really whether China as a state or civilization would survive. History suggests it would in some form.
Exactly. The real crucial question isn't if China collapses, but rather if a post-CCP era actually manages to create a political structure that is maybe more humane, more open, and institutionally stronger, through things like rule of law and accountability.
And the answer to that question determines whether the new Chinese state ultimately emerges stronger or just weaker and more fractured on the world stage.
That's the core uncertainty at the end of the day.
A very powerful thought to leave things on. Thank you so much for walking us through that incredibly complex scenario.
My pleasure. It's important stuff to think through, even if it's hypothetical.
Absolutely. And if you, our listener, found this deep dive valuable, please do subscribe to Sip and Talk wherever you get your audio.
We really appreciate the support.
And one more thing before you go, definitely check out our good friend Micky's YouTube channel. It's called Micky to Life.
Yeah, Micky's great. Lots of fun stuff over there. Memes, music chat, some really interesting wine tasting vlogs, travel videos.
It's the perfect antidote if contemplating potential geopolitical collapse has got you feeling a bit stressed. Go check out Micky to Life.
You won't regret it.
All right, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.